Hey everybody, this is Coach Chance. Welcome back to Sky Oaks Chess Club Advanced Lessons. This is week number 3, and this week we are going to be learning a second type of Sicilian. This is the Dragon Sicilian, and we have a special guest with us this week, Coach Xander.
Hello, everybody.
And Coach Xander is much, much better at the Dragon Sicilian than I am last week. We learned my variation of the Sicilian, the Najdorf, but Coach Xander has been playing the Dragon Sicilian for a very long time and has been very, very successful with it. And so he has graciously agreed to come and teach you the basics of the Dragon Sicilian. So without any further ado, I will hand this lesson off to Coach Xander.
Yeah. Well, the first thing you need to know about the dragon is that it's just an objectively cooler name than the Najdorf. But it has a lot of the same concepts to start, at least. So the starting moves e4, c5. Basic principle is still the same as the Najdorf. You are trying to basically control the center from the flank to preserve your center pawns, and ideally trade that c pawn for the central d pawn on white's board. So white usually plays knight f3 here, and then you can either go d6, knight c6. Either one's fine. I personally prefer knight c6, and that's what we'll play here. It just is a little more. It dodges a couple slightly annoying variations that aren't bad for you, but just aren't really Dragon Sicilian material. Um, so d4 is the usual move here. And one thing that I also want to mention right now ahead of time is that computer analysis for Sicilians in general and the Dragon in particular is notoriously finicky. So it's not a case with some openings where you want to kind of rigorously pay attention to the algorithmic evaluations. Obviously, if you suddenly drop an evaluation by like 3 points or something, that means you've probably blundered. But for the most part, it is not entirely accurate as to the situation. There's a couple of reasons for this, which I'm not going to get into, but that's worth noting. So c takes d4, that's the reason we have the c pawn there. And then knight takes d4, that's the reason that the knight's there. A line that you should be worried about is instead of knight takes, white plays c3. It's very aggressive, and you can do very well in this line, but it's worth noting that you should tread very carefully if c3 occurs. In this case, I like playing d5 for black after c3, but that is besides the point. That's a line that you should be aware of. So at this point, knight of 6, d6, and g6 are all options. There's not much of a difference between them, but all of them are pretty solid. I think that d6 is usually pretty reliable, but knight f6 is also kind of the main line dragon variation. So knight f6 is what we're going to analyze here. And now white basically just wants to defend the pawn. So knight c3 is usually the move here. And then now, if you're going into the dragon, you want to play d6 here. And the reason is you want to basically bring that light squared bishop either to d7 or to eventually g4. G4 is a little more of a niche pick, but you want to have the options there. And by putting your pawns on e7 and d6, you're basically saying, I'm going to move my dark squared bishop to g7, because otherwise it would just be too much work to move both of those pawns so that my bishop can maneuver. So white has a couple of options here, and it'll start going into a little more of a stylistic thing at this point. Bishop g5 is a solid choice. Wait, oh, I missed a move. You want to play g6 before. Um, g6 before d6 in most scenarios. Bit of an oversight on my part, but I apologize. Because right now, there isn't much of a threat. The computer will say that e5 is very strong for white after taking on c6, but that is actually a little bit misleading. You basically just drop your knight back, and you still have a very strong position. Um, so we're just going through that line because I know people are going to be concerned about seeing a like plus 1.15 on the computer analysis. So knight takes c3, c6, b takes c6, e5, knight h5, then bishop c4. What you can do here is play d5. And also you'll notice that as we go into the variation, the computer is starting to shift it a little more towards black again. And basically in this situation, you end up getting a pretty strong center. Your knight's a little awkwardly placed, but it's worth it for the central presence. So if we go back, um, and at that point it's just a game of chess. But if we go back, so g6 instead of d6. What you want to do as white usually is play one of three moves, which are bishop e3, bishop c4, and bishop e2. This is definitely a stylistic thing. Bishop e2 basically is playing for a more positional game than the other two. Bishop c4 is basically telling you that this is a player who's very much interested in attacking your king right now. And bishop e3 is basically just a flexible move. It's kind of non-committal and there's not much to it. But yeah. So we're going to go with bishop e3 right now because it's non-committal and that allows us to go into a little more of the concepts of the dragon without focusing on specific variations. So at this point, you probably want to play either bishop g7 or d6, one of the two. Um, I like bishop g7 personally because in some situations you can get away with playing pawn to d5, and if you can get away with pawn to d5, then it's usually a decent move. But you need to get a lot of support for that pawn. But if you can get that pawn on d5, you're usually looking pretty good in pretty much any Sicilian type. At least the ones that I play primarily. So bishop g7, then bishop e2 and bishop c4 are two stylistic things, like I said. Bishop c4, in my experience, is the more common move to see. And then just castle, develop your position. Um, this opening gets very, very sharp, but it also is a lot of just, messing around with your pieces and making sure that you've got a setup early on. So, in this scenario, usually f3 is the move that is seen. There are other choices. They aren't really super threatening, to be honest. Um, and at any point, if your opponent plays something that's not book, just say, okay, I've got a game of chess on my hands. Like, odds are it's not a blunder. There's a lot of ways you can go about the Sicilian. But you want to just check in, think, why did they do that? And move from there, along with having an understanding of the concepts of the Sicilian and maybe something that can help you. So, f3 is primarily a tool to play queen d2 later, and then try for bishop to h6 to try to trade off the dark squared bishops. Because black's dark squared bishop in the dragon is absolutely brutal. If you look at that diagonal, there's basically no obstruction. And since white usually castles queenside, there is. It's called the fire breathing bishop in most cases. It's the fire breathing dragon of the dragon because it just has a straight shot right down the center at the enemy king. So it is in white's interest to try to trade it off if they can. So at this point, usually d6 is the move. And in this case, you're basically just continuing to develop. So white plays queen d2, queen d2, and then You've got knight e5 as the computer says. You've got queen c7. You got knight a5. You've got a couple options here to go about it. Um, Usually, I consider bishop d7 to be just kind of reliable. Um, but there are plenty of options of going about that, and that's one of the nice things about the dragon. There's so many different ways of going about it that you don't feel exactly railroaded into a specific variation every time. And that also increases the volatility of the position and makes it, more variation. So bishop d7, and then the computer is saying knight takes c6 and castle kingside, which let me tell you, both A is not a situation in which white is ahead by half a pawn, and B is not what people who play white in the dragon want to do. Um, because if white takes the knight, you take back with the b pawn, and you just start playing for the center, and you have a very good chance of winning that center. But most of the time, white will castle queenside because this is the point where the dragon becomes basically two chess players just trying to desperately beat the snot out of the enemy king position before they get their king position snot beaten out of them. So
I'll
castle's
go
queenside.
ahead. I'll go ahead and interject here. So, in this position, if you are interested in playing a mix of positional and tactical gameplay, the first part of this game was very positional. You were trying to get your pieces into very nice spots for yourself. This next part of the game that you'll see, and we went over this in our Making a Plan video on the regular lessons, where White's idea is to castle queenside, shoot their rook over to the other side, and hammer on your king with just about everything they have. Likewise, you are going to be doing the exact same thing to them, and it's just going to be a race to see who gets there first. The dragon is one of the most attacking openings that you will see, and neither side is defending here. This is a pure race to see who wins.
Yeah, it's basically taking the concept of opposite sides castling that often occurs in games and basically running with it to the point where, normally if your kings are castled on the same position, it's kind of difficult to launch a bit of a pawn attack or just a strong attack on your enemy king without, exposing your king a bit and potentially opening yourself up to some positional or tactical weaknesses. In this, white is going to be just shoving those H and G pawns down as far as they can into black's position and seeing what happens. And black is going to try to do the same with the C file, or potentially the B pawn or A pawn. Usually, though, it's a little more of a piece based attack for black and more of a pawn based one for white. Um, so in this case, A6 and Queen C7 are both options. They are kind of two slightly separate schools of thought on how to attack, but both of them are entirely viable. I personally like Queen C7, but A6 is entirely viable. So, in this case, the computers
I'll
recommend.
I'll go ahead
Oh,
and note again that this is where you see something a little bit more like the Najdorf. This is a very Najdorf idea where we play a6. And you remember when we had that bishop on c4, we wanted to play b5 to kick it out of there. Well, now the king is castled queenside, and a6 to b5 moves that bishop out of the way of that c file that Coach Xander said we want to attack. So some Najdorf ideas in the dragon, and of course they're both Sicilian, so they are going to share some ideas.
yeah. So, worth noting. Yeah, you can cross use ideas from both variants of the Sicilian. And that's also an aspect with openings where learning an opening properly will kind of transcend just that opening. For example, you can use concepts from the King's Indian in some variations of the Sicilian. You can use concepts from the Queen's Gambit in a lot of D pawn openings, even if they're not the Queen's Gambit. Like if you're learning the concepts beyond just a rote memorization of the moves, then you can apply the concepts that you see into another situation. It's like tactics in a way, where if you see a basic tactical concept in a tactic, you'll be more likely to use that or observe it and see it, and maybe even induce it in another game than if you hadn't previously seen that type of tactic. Um, so yeah, you'll notice all three of White's computer recommended moves are bishop moves. That is because if the knight moves, then the bishop is in danger from the queen. And bishop b3 is probably one of the more common ones. I think bishop e2 is usually what I see, but both of them are very common, and both of them are solid. Um, we'll do bishop b3 because I think it's a little more of it's the more dangerous one of the two. Bishop e2, you just kind of keep playing your position. Bishop b3 is a little more kill or be killed type thing. So I prefer rook fc8 here to rook ac8, and that is because if the bishop goes to h6, then you can play bishop h8 because your bishop is no longer pinned to your rook on f8 because it's not there. However, in a lot of variations of the dragon, White can make some changes in their position to basically sacrifice other small advantages in order to get that so that the bishop goes to h6 while the rook is pinned. In that case, it is crucial that you do not take the bishop on h6 and let them take your bishop on g7 so your king can come in and prevent the queen from going to h6 free. Um, that is just a concept that you want to understand in this. And oftentimes in Sicilian attacks, Dragon Sicilian attacks, the bishops will end up being traded off, and the queen will be try to sneak into h6, which is kind of a crux of White's plan. They're going to try to open up that h file and start attacking down it. But your plan is primarily to attack on the c file and slash or mess with pawns to try to disrupt that queenside castle position that White has. So rook fc8. Now g4 and h4 both very common. Um, I think g4 is the more common of the two. They're very much similar in basically what they're trying to do, but both of them are just kind of just the unga bunga, I'm just going to smash my pawn down on you like a caveman type. Just it's a simple attack, but it's effective. So g4, and now knight a5 or knight e5, both solid moves. Knight a5 is a little better in my opinion. It threatens the bishop immediately, and you know you're probably not going to take the bishop. Then it's probably going to to c4, but it's nice having the option just in case something comes up. Essentially, so knight a5, um, knight e5 also entirely valid though. Like there is no definitive correct way of going about it. It's definitely a stylistic thing. So if you see here, the computer is recommending king b1, and that seems like a little bit of an odd move, but it is entirely the correct thing to do for White, because basically that's trying to get the king off of off of the file and try to mitigate the attack. Um, one thing you'll notice though is that this computer variation is focusing more on defense than offense, and that's more of just an aspect of how computers will play uncertain positions than anything. Um, in this case, your attack is slowed, but their attack is slowed, and you can basically continue on with the concepts that we'll talk about in other lines, but with this slight difference. So king b1 is worth noting. At that point, it's a game of chess. So if we go back, usually h4 is played. It's just there's something about it. Like it's a good move, and also after g4 is played, like admit it, everybody wants their h4 pawn to be right there too. Um, so yeah, so there is danger in this position, and I just want to put the knight to c4 to see what the computer thinks about it, because that's going to be interesting. So yeah, so this is one case in which having the knight on c4, and I did this as a little bit of a quick analysis helper. Having the knight on c4 is kind of disadvantaged by your queen being on c7, because if you were able to take back with the rook, it would be slightly stronger. And for that reason, I also like queen a5 as an option instead of potentially queen c7 all that way back. But again, multiple choices. So if we go back, but note that knight c4 is an option that should be considered in many Sicilian variations. So I agree with the computer saying that knight takes b3 is a solid move here. But one thing that's interesting is after a takes b3, you basically just have a bit of a more positional dragon, if you can call it that. And the basic black plan is to attack on the queen side, while white attacks on the king side, and you want to prevent white from opening up the h file and getting both rooks on it. That's white's main win condition, while bringing in the knight from c3 to d5. And I want to choose a variation that'll be a little more demonstratable on how to prevent that. So if we go back a little bit, just pull us back like 3 moves, 4 moves. Actually, the best way to show this is with the positions in which the bishop is on e2 instead of b3. Um, the concepts still work, but it's a little more visceral in bishop e2 scenarios. So usually rook f to c8, and actually I'm going to even use a queen a5 variation as a further teaching tool. So if we go back, yeah, here. So queen a5 here. This is the line that I usually play in this sort of situation. So I have a little more experience with this in regards to the rest of them. It is a little sharper though, so I'm just kind of warning that it is more inherently dangerous than some of the other lines. But I mean, if you're playing the Sicilian and the Dragon in particular, you're accepting a level of risk.
And you know what? Maybe we, as a coaching group, want to hold off on perhaps teaching any more past this. We've already gone over the general principles of the dragon, and really it's up to you now whether you think as a player that you would like to continue learning the dragon, continue learning about the principles, whether you like it for your playstyle or not. And we'd like to hear your feedback on that. If you would like to learn more about the dragon, then we can come back to this position in another video, if Coach Sander will, of course, come back
Yeah,
and teach this.
I'd
Or,
love to teach everyone the rucksack, but yes.
of course, um, but this is the point at which we go ahead and say, hey, is this your playstyle? Do you like what you're seeing here? And do you like the idea of attack or be attacked with this pawn storm and your pawn storm and piece storm on them? And I think that is really what defines who plays what Sicilian. Of course, Coach Xander loves attacking about as much as I do, but I prefer the counter-attacking style of the Najdorf much more to this all-out attack or be attacked scenario with the dragon, which is why I play the Najdorf instead. I'm much more of a preventative counter-attack type player, and Coach Xander likes to go all out. And uh, let's hear it from you guys. When I meet with you next, we'll discuss, do you like the Dragon Sicilian more, Or do you like the Najdorf Sicilian more? And we'll continue our lessons from that point. So thank you guys so much for watching, and good luck in your games this week. I'll talk to you later.
Still.